Hello everyone, it's Tabitha and welcome back to IB Economics. Today we're going to be exploring chapter 4.2 in Globalization about free trade and protectionism. And to start with our standard level content. To begin, what even is free trade? Well, by definition, free trade is said to take place between countries when there are no barriers to trade put in place by governments or international organizations, which we'll be looking at later on, like WTO. Okay? Goods and services are therefore allowed to move freely between countries. So essentially, it's just trade without barriers. That's why it's free trade. But by contrast, we're going to introduce a new term called protectionism, which is the opposite of free trade. Okay, so if you guys don't know what protectionism is, a very simple definition is that it's policies and actions that World Trade Organizations or government policies put in place to prevent trading from occurring. If the government implements policies for protectionism and gets rid of free trade, therefore, because of it, then it goes against everything we learned in the last video, which is chapter 4.1 into the introduction of globalization, which is talking about why do countries trade. And we listed about 10 different big reasons why countries trade and how it benefits all countries no matter what. However, these options will be taken away if countries choose protectionism instead. So if international trade is so good for all the countries concerned, like we discussed before, then why is it that countries do not want to trade fairly? We're going to be investigating a number of reasons that have been put forward for this, although the arguments are not always valid. So we're going to be evaluating the following arguments, which include a lot, as you can see here, whereby some countries argue that they need protectionism in order to protect domestic employment, protect their economy from low-wage labor, protect sunrise industries, avoid over-specialization for strategic or war reasons, to avoid dumping, to protect product standards, to raise government revenue, and to correct a balance of payments deficient. So let's go through all of them one by one. All right, starting with domestic employment. Now, we already know what this means. Employment from macroeconomics is when people have jobs, and domestic means it stays in the country. Okay, it's the country's employment. At any given time in an economy, there will be some industries that are in decline. Sunset industries. Now, we're going to be introducing two new terms. I mentioned sunrise before, and then we have sunset here. A sunrise industry is a new industry, therefore it's sunrise because it's just beginning up and it's coming to the light of day. Whereas an industry that's in decline and is slowly coming to a close is going to be a sunset industry because it's going away from the day and going away from the energy and therefore leaving the economy. Because they cannot compete with foreign competition. This is the main reason why big sunset industries are in decline. If the industries are relatively large, this will lead to high levels of structural unemployment. Okay, and if you guys recall the definition of structural unemployment from the macroeconomics unit, obviously when a huge industry suddenly shuts down, there will be a long-term structural unemployment for all the workers who had been previously trained with specific skills for that industry who no longer have similar work, okay? Governments often attempt to protect the industries in order to avoid this unemployment. Therefore, governments implement protectionist policies in order to limit foreign competition and keep big industries in competition so that way they do not become sunset industries, they do not cause unemployment, and it helps the economy stay afloat overall. But now to evaluate this argument. Well, it might be seen as not very strong, since it is likely that the industry will continue to decline and that protectionism will simply prolong the process, therefore saying that protectionist laws implemented by the government into a country will only stop the industry from sunsetting for a longer period of time but not completely diminish it, okay? Although there will be short-run social costs, it might be argued that it would be better to let the resources employed in the industry move into other areas of the economy, meaning that it's sometimes better for a sunset industry to end if it means that other resources can be used more efficiently in the rest of the economy. However, in some cases, the negative consequences of a rapidly declining major industry may be so great that the government feels obligated to intervene and protect the market. So let's say in a hypothetical country, the technology industry, which is a huge industry, is declining because it can't compete with foreign competition from Japan, a really technologically advanced country. Well, the effects of the technology industry within my given country may be so great that the government has to intervene, or else they risk losing GDP and going into debt from all the money that the country spends on imports of technology instead of using domestically produced technology. Therefore, we can conclude that protectionism can protect domestic structural employment. Protecting the economy from low-cost labor. It is often argued that the main reason for declining domestic industries is the low cost of labor in exporting countries, and that the economy should be protected from imports that are produced in countries where the cost of labor is very low. Think of places in Asia, Southern Asia, specifically in places like China, Taiwan, or Mongolia. Those are places with very low cost of labor. There is much greater job insecurity among manufacturing workers throughout the more developed countries, as workers lose their job to workers in emerging markets and developing countries. Workers and their trade unions may lobby vigorously for protection against imported goods. So essentially, this is all continuing the idea that, if you guys recall from microeconomics, as a firm pays its employees less for doing the same amount of work, it is lowering its factor's cost of production. Therefore, it can start to sell the product at a lower price. Therefore, it becomes more competitive on the world market. And therefore, it can be argued that declining domestic industries are mainly declining because of the lower prices caused by the lowering wages and the lower factor of production costs in total from other countries. Therefore, we can argue that protectionism protects the economy from low-cost labor and the low-cost goods imported because of it. But to continue with the evaluation, the argument of protection against low-cost labor goes against the whole concept of comparative advantage. If you guys recall from the last video I did, which is basically suggesting that some countries will have comparative advantage compared to others in terms of low cost or like lower skilled labor. So that means that they have a comparative advantage for it and should therefore specialize in low skilled labor chores. It would mean that domestic producers would pay higher prices than they should, and that the production in the protected economy would take place at an inefficient level. Okay, therefore, comparative advantage would not be efficient because it wouldn't exist in this case. The country wishing to export would lose trade and their economy would suffer. However, it should also be recognized that a comparative advantage changes over time, and that a country that has a comparative advantage in the production of a good at present might not have it in the future, meaning that some countries that have the comparative advantage in low-cost labor right now may not have it in the future. Therefore, the government can use supply-side policies that focus on labor markets to emphasize the importance of making labor flexible enough to adapt to changing economic circumstances. This puts some responsibility on governments to help those workers who have lost their jobs due to increased competition from countries that have developed their comparative advantage in the production of labor-intensive goods. Okay, number 3, protecting a sunrise industry. So we already explained before what a sunset is. Now let's talk about a sunrise industry, which I did mention before. Many governments argue that an industry that is just developing, so a sunrise industry, may not have the economies of scale that larger industries in other countries may enjoy. The domestic industry will not be competitive against foreign imports until it can gain the cost advantages of economies of scale and just grow larger in size overall. Because of this, it is argued that the industry needs to be protected against imports until it achieves a size where it is able to compete on an equal footing in terms of amounts of resources and factors of production, okay? Because of this, it can be argued that there is no basis for the idea that industries in developed countries will set up in a relatively small way and thus not benefit from economies of scale. So this is essentially saying the idea that not all sunrise industries start off small. If they have a lot of funding and they are really in demand, a sunrise industry can start on a quite large economy of scale, making it immediately competitive to foreign markets as well, okay? And with access to highly developed capital markets, it is hard to imagine that a new industry would not set up in the most efficient size and way possible. Number 4, to avoid the risks of over-specialization. Governments may want to limit over-specialization if it means that the country could become over-dependent on the export sales of one or two products. So continuing from our last video where we mentioned specialization, certain countries will specialize in certain tasks, jobs, or in the production of a specific resource based on the resources that their given country has. However, if governments focus too much on specializing on certain things in their countries, then they will have to rely most of their economy on exporting one, two, or just a few specific things to every other country and have to rely on imports from every other country to make sure that people get what they need in their economy. Therefore, we introduced the concept of over-specialization, whereby a country relies way too heavily on specialization and relies on other countries buying so much from their exports that their economy still continues to grow. Any change in the world markets for these products might have serious consequences for this given country's economy, obviously. The introduction of new products or changes in the patterns of demand and supply can have serious effects on the economies of developing countries, which tend to over-specialize in the production of primary products without choice. So essentially it's saying that there are both advantages and risks to countries specializing so closely on one or two goods, whereby some countries, especially developing countries, only have the resources for primary products like an agricultural industry, that they can only produce a certain amount of goods and rely on the money from those exports to import other goods that they cannot produce in that given country. However, this is a huge risk because if something happens in the world market whereby people stop demanding agricultural goods from this specific country, then obviously their economy is going to collapse collapse because they no longer have the funds that they had before from their exports. And as for evaluation, there are no real arguments against this view, as it does not promote protectionism. It simply points out the problems that country may face if they specialize to a great extent and rely so heavily on comparative advantages. Number 5, strategic reasons, also known as war reasons. It is sometimes argued that certain industries need to be protected in case they are needed at times of war. For example, agricultural, steel, and power generation. Steel is needed for many defense items such as planes and tanks, and the steel industry would argue that it must be protected in order to stay competitive. So this is essentially continuing the thought before about the problems with over-specialization. For example, if country A is relying all of their steel imports from country B, but somehow country A gets in a war with country B, and this huge resource which they need, steel, obviously they can't get to it because they're fighting with country B. Therefore, there's also problems with countries relying too heavily on one specific country or economy to give them a certain good or import. Therefore, some governments may implement protectionist measures to make sure that certain industries that produce certain products that are considered to be really important to an economy strategy in a desperate time of war, for example, they might use protectionist measures to protect this industry so that they always have it domestically and they don't have to worry about imports or exports to find them, especially when they need it in a rush, okay? But to a certain extent, this argument may be a valid one, although it is often overstated. That's a huge problem with this one. In many cases, it is unlikely that countries will go to war, or if they do, that they will be completely cut off from all supplies. So while I just mentioned that example of country A relying on country B for all their steel imports for war, well, obviously in the real world, that's not how it works. It's so rare for a country to only rely on one other country to get all their imports from a really huge market. Therefore, country A would actually rely mostly on country B, but also have steel imports from country C, D, and E, okay? Therefore, it is likely that this argument specifically is mostly being used as an excuse for protectionism. Number 6, to prevent dumping. Well, let's understand what this even means, okay? So dumping is the selling by a country of large quantities of a commodity at a lower price than its production cost in another country. For example, the EU may have a surplus of butter and sell this at a very low cost to a small developing economy. This may ruin their domestic producers in the developing country. So if we think about this logically, this kind of makes sense. So for example, if the EU made, 500 million tubs of butter, but only sold 300 million tons of butter, it had 200 million extra tons of butter that they have nothing to do with, they don't want it anymore because nobody's demanding it, and the butter is going to expire, then obviously to find a way to still seek profit and not just waste that food by throwing it away, it might just sell it at a very cheap price to a bunch of other countries. However, if they sell it in large enough quantities at a cheap enough price, it's considered to be dumping on other countries because the EU is just trying to dump or get rid of all the extra butter and just make a tiny bit of money back from the overproduction. And obviously, if the EU is selling this butter to a country with domestically produced butter at a very cheap price, this is going to ruin the domestic producers in the typically developing countries. Where countries can prove that their industries have been severely damaged by dumping, the governments are allowed, under international trade rules, which we'll investigate later on, to impose anti-dumping measures to reduce the damage. And that's where protectionism comes in. However, it is very difficult to prove whether or not a foreign industry has actually been guilty of dumping. It's impossible to measure to a certain extent. In addition, a government that subsidizes a domestic industry may actually support dumping. For example, developing countries argue that when the EU exports subsidized sugar, it is actually a case of dumping because the price doesn't reflect the actual cost of the EU sugar producers. Because obviously, if you guys remember how subsidies work, it's basically where the supply curve moves down. Therefore, producers spend less money to produce the same amount of good. Therefore, when they sell the product and export it, it is considered to be dumping because the price is lower than that than it actually costs to make the product. So therefore, if dumping does actually occur, it is more likely that there will be a need for talks between governments rather than any forms of protectionism, okay? Therefore, they can come to an agreement by themselves. And also, there is always the danger that protectionism will invite retaliatory actions by foreign governments, and this reduces the benefits that can be gained by consumers and producers in all countries. So essentially, this is just introducing the idea that countries are petty as heck, okay? If country A, out of nowhere, introduces a bunch of protectionist measures to prevent trade from country B, and country B feels really hurt by this, they may do the same and implement a bunch of protectionist measures against country A. Therefore, they're kind of fighting in a way using protectionist laws. All right, number 7, to protect product standards. A country might wish to impose safety, health, or environmental standards on goods being imported into its domestic market in order to ensure that the imports match the standards of domestic products. Makes sense. For example, the EU banned the importing of US beef in the 1980s because it was treated with hormones. Therefore, in this case, the US beef being treated with hormones was not up to the safety and healthy standards that the EU had in place for their domestically produced products. This is when we get introduced to something I mentioned before, and we will talk about a lot more in the next video. WTO, the World Trade Organization, which allows countries to impose such bans. The World Trade Organization, which, as a quick summary, is essentially a place where all countries come together to talk about trading with each other, which allows countries to also impose such bans as long as the barrier is based on scientific evidence, and as long as the country imposing the ban does not discriminate between countries where similar products are traded, allowed this to happen. The EU and the United States eventually reached an agreement in 2009 to grant a quota, which we'll be looking at later on in this video, for hormone-free beef imports. But obviously, for a certain amount of time, the EU banned the US because of the product standards. For an evaluation, the protection of standards is a valid argument, as long as the concerns themselves are valid. However, many of the reasons given for bans when standards are not reached are considered to be simply subtle means of protectionism. Certainly, there's a strong feeling amongst US for protectionism. Where there's a dispute over product standards, a response by the exporting country might be to use retaliatory, again, countries being petty, retaliatory protectionist policies. In the EU-US beef dispute that I mentioned before, the US retaliated against the EU in May 1999 by imposing trade sanctions on imports from Europe worth $117 million. So obviously this is just showing how, in a real-life example, the pettiness of countries trying to retaliate against one another using protectionist measures can actually affect their GDPs by as much as over 100 million in the real world. Therefore, countries have to be really careful when implementing protectionist measures and have to make sure that their argument for the measure is completely valid. But another issue related to the use of product standards as a trade barrier is the cost of involving meeting standard products. This is a particular concern for producers in developing countries. Not only does it cost a great deal to meet the standards, but the cost of getting appropriate approval on documentation to prove that the standards have been met are extremely high. For example, think about the FDA, which at least in the US is I don't know what it stands for, but it's basically to test the health and safety standards of food and other products that are used, around somebody's face, like makeup in the US. However, to be approved by the FDA and have the right documents to prove that you can sell your stuff safely in the US, it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time, which are two resources that developing countries just may not have. This puts producers in the developing countries at a disadvantage, and it may make it difficult for such countries to exploit their competitive advantage successfully due to this. All right, this one's fairly simple, but number 8 is to raise government revenue. In many developing countries, it is difficult to collect taxes, and so governments may impose import taxes or tariffs, which we'll look at again later on in more detail, on products in order to raise revenue. So the textbook here gave us an example of some developing countries here and the percentages of government revenue made from tariffs in 2017 versus 2012. And as you can see, for places like Lesotho, almost half of their entire government revenue comes from tariffs, which is a huge amount of money. So obviously here we can see examples of how it helps in the real world. Now for an evaluation, this is not so much an argument for protectionism, but more of a means of raising government revenue, and just a way to point it out. And in fact, the import duties are actually a tax on the consumers in the country who are buying the imports. Therefore, if you argue that we should use protectionism to raise government revenue, the people suffering are going to be people in your own country, not people from other countries that you import from. Okay, and lastly, number 9, to correct a balance of payments deficit. Okay, we're going to take a look at what this means now. Governments may sometimes impose protectionist measures in an attempt to reduce import expenditure and thus improve a current account deficit, whereby the country is spending more on its imports of goods and services than it is for earning its exports of goods and services. So I'm going to bring back something from macroeconomics that I'm sure you guys are going to recognize. All right, if you guys recognize this formula, as you should, it is going to be the formula for calculating the GDP of a country, which is government plus investment plus consumption plus X minus M, also known as exports minus imports. Something called a balance of payments or a current account deficit is essentially what comes from this area right here. So basically, if a country earns less from exports than it spends on imports and this value becomes negative, it actually takes away from the total GDP, meaning that it's in a deficit. Therefore, countries always try to aim to make more money from their exports to other countries than they spend on imports from those other countries, okay? However, protectionist measures to prevent this from happening and this becoming negative only works in the short run. It does not address the actual problem, obviously, because the government hasn't as of yet addressed why are the exports not selling, why are so many imports selling. Instead, they're just avoiding the issue by putting in protectionist policies which are short term. Okay, so it does not rectify the actual causes of the current account deficit or why they're occurring. Also, if countries decide to do this, then it is likely that other countries will, again, retaliate with protectionist measures of their own. All right, so now that we looked at arguments and evaluations of the arguments for trade protectionism in given countries, we again have to recount arguments against trade protectionism, which is also known as arguments for free trade. Well, the arguments against protectionism are actually just related and the exact same as the reasons why countries trade, which I explained in the last video. In brief, the arguments against protectionism and going for free trade include the following. Protectionism may raise prices to consumers and producers of the imports that they buy. It would lead to less choice for consumers. Competition would diminish if foreign firms are kept out of another country, and so domestic firms may become less efficient without the incentive to minimize costs. Innovation may also be reduced for the same reason, and export competitiveness of the domestic firms are going to be reduced as well. Protectionism distorts comparative advantage, leading to the inefficient use of the world's resources. Specialization is reduced and doesn't exist at some points. Protectionism may lead to a retaliation by other countries with the potential for a trade war, which is essentially where countries become really petty and start forming laws of protectionism against other countries, which is a trade war because they're going to war with the trade from another country with escalating tariffs that just become more and more insanely expensive. And for the reasons listed above, protectionism may hinder overall economic growth. All right, but now that we've already covered the bulk of most of the theory for this chapter, now let's go ahead and introduce some graphs and analysis. Of course, the fun part. So now let's take a look at what does free trade actually look like on a graph. So before we read the analysis, let's take a look at what we see over here. As you can see from a quick glance, this looks just like a microeconomic graph that we already introduced in the second unit. A price ceiling, whereby there is a line below the equilibrium at a certain new price. And therefore, this graph, as well as most of the graphs in this last unit, are going to be microeconomic graphs. Therefore, we're going to keep quantity on the y-axis and price on the x-axis, 0 here. And as for the equilibrium, we have the D demand curve that stays the same. However, the name of the supply curve changes. It changes to S domestic, meaning that it's the domestic and it's happening locally to the country we're talking about. And then as for the price ceiling, this new line here is going to be at price PW, also known as world price. The W stands for world. And on the other side of it, this is going to be S world, okay? So we have S domestic, so it's domestic supply, and then we have world supply here. And then obviously we have a few different lines here. We have the original equilibrium of quantity QE at price PE, and then we also draw little dashes down from where the world supply hits the domestic supply and the demand, which would be at Q1 and then Q2, relatively speaking. Now let's read the analysis. So if there was no foreign trade, then domestic farmers would produce from 0 to QE tons of wheat. So ignoring this line for a minute, if there was no foreign trade and this was just the domestic market, it would look like a normal equilibrium, okay? And a quantity QE at price PE would be supplied and demanded like we already learned in microeconomics. But if we now assume that the market is open in the country and that foreign trade does take place, then the situation changes. We have a new line here. Consumers find that they can import wheat at the world price, which is PW, and that if they're prepared to pay the world price, they can import as much wheat as they like. This means that the supply curve faced by the importers is perfectly elastic. All right, so a few things here. First of all, once we introduce foreign trade, we're going to introduce a new world price. And obviously, if people import from the rest of the world, the biggest reason why people import is because of lower price. Therefore, the world price and the world supply is always going to be below the equilibrium price of the domestic country, just to prove that basically importing a product is cheaper than buying it domestically, okay? And obviously, because theoretically we can buy as much of this product from around the world that we want to at the same price, it's completely elastic. Theoretically, because in the real world, this doesn't actually happen and nothing is unlimited. But again, we're saying in theory, so let's keep it as a straight line, which means it is completely elastic. And just to rectify it here, S world supply must always be below the price equilibrium in the domestic country, or else there'd be no point in trading because it would be as or more expensive. With free trade, the price of wheat in the country will be PW, meaning that it's at the world price here. At this price, domestic farmers will only be prepared to supply this quantity of good right here from 0 to Q1. As obviously, when you consider both of these lines in this area here, domestic supply starts off cheaper, and then slowly it goes up and it becomes more expensive to buy domestically than it does at the world price. And it's at this point here that it becomes more expensive versus the world price staying the same. This means that theoretically, in the domestic country, people would start buying cheaper from domestic producers up to the certain point of Q1. Therefore, at this point, they have to choose. Do they want to start importing at a cheaper world price or paying a higher price from a domestically supplied good? Well, obviously, most people are going to choose the world price and import it from other countries instead because obviously it's cheaper and we all want to be cheap and save our money. And as you guys can see here, the demand actually continues until it crosses here at the world supply. Therefore, there's an excess demand right here between Q1 and Q2. Therefore, this is going to be satisfied by consumers of this country importing from Q1 to Q2 the given good at the world price. Therefore, quantities between Q1 and Q2 is going to be satisfied by imports instead of bought domestically. And obviously at the end right here, as demand goes down and people want less, we don't have to worry about what people buy here because people don't want to buy anything anymore at this point. However, one more thing to consider here is that, again, if we're to consider this without free trade, meaning that this line doesn't exist, before the economy was in equilibrium, when people were demanding and getting in supply, QE, quantity of the given product. However, after world trade, the quantity of the product that they can get increases from QE to Q2, as they can now buy more of the product between QE and Q2 at a cheaper price from imports. Therefore, you can say that domestic consumers from this given country and economy get to consume QE to Q2 more amount of goods at this lower world price. Okay, but now let's take a look at the opposite situation. When do countries actually export? Now let's take a look at the graph before we read the analysis once again. So again, this is going to be a microeconomic based theory graph. And like we saw before, which was a price ceiling graph, this is reminiscent of a price floor graph, whereby we have a different price above the market equilibrium. Price again on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis is 0 here. We have the same demand curve as before, and we have the same supply, domestic supply curve here. And we also now have changed the world supply curve to be at a higher price of PW than at the equilibrium price of PE. And again, we have the quantities given here. Now, a country is able to export a product when the country can produce it and sell it at a price that is below the price that the product would sell on the world market. Obviously, this makes sense. If country A can produce a pound of butter for 50 cents, and in the rest of the world, you can only produce and sell a pound of butter for $1, then obviously country A wants to export as much butter as possible because they have a cheaper price of 50 cents compared to the rest of the world, meaning that people will be more incentivized to buy their goods as it's cheaper compared to the world price. And this is proven on the graph. If the domestic country has a price that's lower than the world price, then obviously they can now export. But again, let's analyze this. If there was no foreign trade, then the domestic farmers would produce the QE quantity of goods at the price PE. But if we now assume that foreign trade does take place, then the situation changes. Producers find that they can export wheat at the world price, PW, world price, which is above the price that they can sell for domestically, PE. Therefore, producers are going to temporarily increase their prices from PE to price PW until the demand curve intersects the world supply curve at point here, meaning that they sell between 0 and Q1 quantities from their domestic market at the world price. However, it is after Q1 that we see that the world price continues to be just as expensive as before. However, the actual domestically produced product price for exports before they raise it to the world price is actually lower. Okay, remember it's here at PE instead of PW. Therefore, at the certain price here, where consumers are no longer willing to pay this high price, the domestic producers go ahead and bring back down the price of their exports to here, meaning that quantities Q1 to Q2, meaning that this country, this domestic country, is able to export quantities Q1 to Q2 to the rest of the world, as they can now offer this in-between quantity of products at the lower price PE than at the world price of PW. Therefore, the given country can export goods at a cheaper price than the world price between these quantities here, which means that overall, the domestic producers are able to increase the quantity of product that they sell from QE to Q2 as they begin to export their good around the world and sell it domestically. All right, so now that we've already looked at the ways that we can use graphs to represent free trade, let's look at types of protectionism and evaluate specifically tariffs, subsidies, and quotas and how they appear on the graph. Now that we know what happens in a free trade situation, we're going to look at the different types of protectionism, these three here, that may be employed and how they work. All right, to begin with tariffs, if you don't know, by definition, a tariff is a tax that is charged on imported goods. That's the whole definition. And as we already know from our study and a review of microeconomics before, we know that any tax placed upon a good shifts the supply curve vertically upwards by the amount of the tax. So to recall, remember tax makes it go up, all right, for supply and supply too. Okay. In the case of a tariff, it will shift the world supply curve upwards since it is placed on the foreign producers of the good and not on the domestic producers. So now let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so looking at this graph here, obviously it looks very confusing, but just hear me out and we can explain it away. Now, as we've already seen before, price here, quantity here, and a microeconomic graph. Domestic and world demand is right here, just labeled as D. At price PW, world price, we have the world supply. However, we now have a new line, which is the world supply plus tariff, which is at a new price of world price plus T, T standing for tariff. Okay, and obviously, like we said before, because tax shifts a curve up, when we have a diagonal supply curve, obviously it looks diagonal when it shifts up. So if we have a flat supply curve, it's going to be flat when it shifts up and it'll look more like this, okay? And as you guys can see here, we've now drawn a bunch of new lines, okay? We have the original equilibrium before any trade at PE and QE. We have quantities between Q1 and Q2 of imports being taken from the world supply at a lower price after foreign trade is allowed. And now we're going to look at the new quantities we've put in here, which is Q3 and Q4. And as for the shaded boxes and all the numbers, well, we're going to look at it in the analysis, so don't freak out about it yet. So knowing what we already know about how quantity 0 to Q1 is going to be bought domestically and then quantities Q1 to Q2 is going to be bought by cheaper imports, taking all that we already know, we know that before the tariff, the max quantity being bought in total would be here at Q2. Domestic production was this beginning part here, imports was this parts in between. However, when the tariff is imposed, it shifts up the world price or the world supply by the amount of the tariff, which is going to be the plus T, which makes it shift up by that much in price. Therefore, we can prove how before the tariff, the most quantity supplied for both the world and the domestic supply was at Q2. However, after the government implements a tariff, this decreases from quantity Q2 to Q4, meaning that the highest quantity that can be imported is going to be now between each part where the domestic supply curve hits the new tariff curve, which is right here and here, which means that only quantities between Q3 and Q4 is going to be imported. And if we now know that between quantities Q3 and Q4 is as much as we can import from the world supply, then obviously between 0 and Q3 is as much as we can buy from the domestic supply. As you guys can see here, once the price is lifted here, the domestic supply curve, it increases for a longer amount of time from not just 0 to Q1, but from 0 to Q3 before it intersects the world supply curve with the added tariff. Now meaning that consumers are willing to pay that much more and buy Q3 minus Q1 quantities more of supply from the domestic suppliers before buying a lesser supply by importing from other countries. So just to simplify it, before the tariff, they would buy this much from domestic producers and they would buy this much from importers. But now, since the tariff has been added, they buy this much from domestic producers and this much from importing from other countries. So as you can clearly see, now people in the economy are going to be buying much more from domestic suppliers and much less from world suppliers. We can also use all these labeled letter boxes to prove the effects on the foreign producers and the domestic producers. So as for revenue, the domestic producers, before the tariff was introduced, was only making this amount of money in this box here. Obviously, they were only making this amount of money because it was only between quantity 0 to Q1 that people were willing to pay the cheaper prices from domestic supply. However, now that they are willing to pay more for domestic supply because it's more expensive at the world price, they are now making revenue of all 4 of these boxes, which would include letters G, H, B, C, and A. And as for foreign producers, whereby before the tariff was installed, they would be making all 4 of these boxes worth of revenue because between quantities Q1 and Q2 is where people from the domestic economy were willing to import goods from the rest of the world. Since this is now decreased because of the added tariff and therefore people will only import quantities Q3 to Q4, their revenue has decreased from H, I, J, K to just I and J. So just these 2 boxes now here instead. And obviously, since the government is getting all the revenue from this tariffs, we can say that boxes E and D right here represent government revenue added and given to them based on how much tariff they put on. And now that I've cleaned off the graph and we look back on it, there are two further outcomes we have to consider based on the diagram here. The first of which is now that we've decreased the quantity bought from both world producers and world suppliers and domestic suppliers from Q2 down to Q4, then obviously this much more of the demand curve is not being met, okay? Whereby just this area wasn't being met before, now a bigger area isn't being met, now that people are importing less from world supply. Therefore, we can say that this shaded box here of the letter F would be representative of the loss of consumer surplus, also known as deadweight loss of welfare, as now consumers are not able to meet as many of their demands as they were before. Something else we have to reconsider is comparative advantage. If the world supply is able to sell the given product, which here is wheat, I didn't mention that before, but here the example is wheat. If the world supply is able to offer wheat at a cheaper price than the domestic supply, then maybe it's because of comparative advantage and they have better resources to make wheat in the most efficient way possible. However, now because of the added protectionist policy of the tariff, it increases how much people can buy from domestic suppliers from 0 Q1 to 0 Q3. Meaning that now, between quantities Q1 and Q3, tons of wheat are being produced by relatively inefficient domestic farmers, as opposed to more efficient foreign farmers who have the comparative advantage in making wheat. Whereas before, the domestic farmers from the world supply would have produced the quantity between here at the price below the curve at letter H. Now that we have to buy it from the domestic suppliers, the minimum revenue that they can have is H plus C. Okay, so now it's a bigger area that they need to support them able to produce the good because they're naturally less efficient than the world market. Therefore, this new shaded box here, C, represents the inefficiency of domestic producers and a loss of world efficiency, since more of the world's resources are being used to produce the wheat than are necessary. So if you were to find the area of this box here, C, that would be the amount of extra world resources that are wasted on inefficient supply. This is another dead weight loss of welfare. So both of these are dead weight losses of welfare, okay? To review, this is consumer welfare loss because less of their demand is being met, whereas this is world welfare being lost because production has now become more inefficient as it avoids comparative advantage. Now, just to conclude, tariffs are the most common type of anti-dumping measure. If a country has been able to prove that dumping has taken place, then it can place a huge tariff on the imported good to raise their prices and eliminate the cost advantage of the dumped imports. So like we mentioned before in the beginning of the video, the reason why dumping is so popular and why so many people buy dumped goods is because they're so cheap. However, if the country recognizes that another country is trying to dump a bunch of cheap goods, they can add tariffs, make them more expensive, and therefore the appeal of people importing them because they're cheap doesn't exist anymore because the product is no longer cheap. All right, now let's talk about the second form of protectionist measure we can value on a graph, which is going to be international trade subsidies. So just to review quickly, if we know that taxes push a curve upwards, then we know that subsidies push a curve downwards and is basically what government gives to firms to help them produce more. A subsidy is a certain amount of money given to a firm per unit of goods that the firm produces more and increases the production of their goods overall. And as we can see here, we have the world supply curve, the demand curve, and the domestic supply curve all looking the same. However, we've now added the new curve of pushing the domestic supply curve downwards to supply domestic plus subsidy, okay? And as you guys can see here, it creates a new quantity of Q3, okay? So now let's look at the analysis. So as we already know before, but just to review, given that the subsidy line doesn't exist here, we know that domestic production was between 0 and Q1, and then imports was between Q1 and Q2. However, when the subsidy is granted, this curve shifts downward from this original curve to the second one by the amount of the subsidy that is given by the government to the firm. However, unlike tariffs, the overall quantity produced does not decrease from Q2 to a lower number because the demand curve stays the same and nothing is changing the world price here. So it stays at Q2 no matter if the subsidy is there or not. So therefore, there's going to be no effect in the long run of quantity being decreased over time as the subsidy is added. However, as we can see here, because the government gives money to firms to decrease their factory production costs, the firms can now sell their products at a lower cost to consumers, meaning that consumers are now willing to buy domestically supplied products at an even greater quantity than before. As you can see here, the price of the domestic supply became greater than the price of the world supply at Q1, but now that we've added the subsidy, it becomes greater than the world supply at Q3, meaning now that quantities 0 to Q3 is going to be bought from domestic suppliers, and instead that quantities Q2 to Q3 is going to be bought by importing at the world price from world suppliers. Okay, and the reason why domestic suppliers are able to increase from Q1 to Q3 is also because now they're receiving the world price plus subsidy per unit of good that they sell. Therefore, we can see that the overall revenue for domestic suppliers increases from the original box here of just A to the boxes here of E, F, G, A, and B. And by contrast, we can see what happens to the revenue of the world suppliers as it decreases from these previous three boxes between Q1 and Q2 of B, C, D, as the B moves to the domestic suppliers, and instead, the world suppliers only now have revenue of C, D right here. And assuming that the government is the one paying the subsidy, then obviously the space between each curve here, which is the amount of the subsidy, also represented here by the shaded section of G, is going to represent the loss in government revenue for paying for the subsidy. All right, and just to continue on, like with the tariff, Q1 to Q3, which is now the increased amount of wheat that people will start buying from domestic suppliers instead of world suppliers because of the subsidy, is now being produced by relatively inefficient domestic farmers, as we're now ignoring the point of comparative advantage. Therefore, we can conclude, like before, the foreign farmers could have produced wheat between the world price curve and the x-axis with just revenue B. But now that we're working with inefficient farmers, the revenue that they need is B plus G. The space is right here. Thus, G represents not only government revenue spent on the subsidy, but also the inefficiency of the domestic producers and a misallocation of the world's resources, since more of the world's resources are now being used to produce the wheat than are necessary. Again, it's another dead weight loss of failure. However, unlike with tariffs, as you guys can see, there's no shaded area over here, as there is no loss of consumer surplus because the demand curve stays the same. And we don't have to cut off any more of the demand curve than between the end and Q2, meaning that we're losing no more demand and there is no loss of consumer surplus in the meantime. However, we do have to consider that consumers are still going to be affected, though indirectly, as governments have to use taxes that they take from consumers to fund the subsidies. Okay, the money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. They don't just print money for subsidies. They get money from subsidies by taxing people. Therefore, this means that higher tax payments must be made by consumers to the government, which also involves an opportunity cost in terms of reduced government spending on other things. Therefore, we can conclude that both the government and consumers have to suffer based on how much more money they're going to have to end up spending to pay for the subsidy of this good. All right, and now the last protectionist measure we're going to be evaluating today is going to be quotas. So once again, taking a look at the diagram, we already have the world supply curve, the domestic supply curve, and the demand curve with the given axes. However, there is now a new quota curve, which is going to be shown as the domestic supply plus quota. And it kind of looks like a subsidy curve from the last graph before. However, it does not continue on beneath like this, beneath the world supply curve. So this is how we're able to tell the difference between a quota and a supply curve. A quota, by definition, if you aren't aware, is a physical limit on the numbers or value of goods that can be imported into a country. For example, the EU imposed import quotas on Chinese garlic and mushrooms. The imposition of a quota has a peculiar effect on the free trade diagram, and this is shown here. So as we've already dissected before any quota, subsidy, or tariff takes place, we know that 0 to Q1 is going to be bought by domestic suppliers, and then Q1 to Q2 is going to be bought by importing from other countries. However, once there is a quota installed, that means that the limit is now at Q3. Therefore, people cannot legally import more from this other country beyond this limit because it's now where the quota curve hits the world supply curve, meaning that demand decreases all the way from Q2 all the way to Q3, which is a huge portion of imports that is lost to the country. However, because there is still such a huge demand missing if you just completely limit the quantity being able to be imported or bought at all from Q2 to Q3, now domestic consumers have to start buying domestic supply. And it re-increases, if I delete this arrow right here, it re-increases from Q3 to Q4. But now this quantity is no longer bought at world price PW from the world supply and is instead bought at the higher price of domestic suppliers, meaning that as you can see here between Q3 and Q4, the price is still increasing. Therefore, the consumers and the economy have to pay more to afford the domestic supply because they are no longer legally able to obtain the world supply. And this continues until there is a new equilibrium of the domestic supply plus the quota with the demand curve, which is at price P quota, which is between the original price equilibrium and the world price, because it's higher than the world price, but it's still a little bit lower than the original price equilibrium, meaning that now at this new price of P quota is how much domestic consumers have to pay to be able to afford the product from domestic suppliers because they are no longer able to import it from foreign suppliers, which means that overall consumption and production of wheat falls from Q2 to Q4. And again, we can use these little boxes to measure the revenue changing between domestic suppliers and world suppliers. For domestic suppliers, they now supply the product for domestic consumers between quantities of U to Q1 and quantities between Q4 and Q3, meaning that the revenue can increase from the original box of just A here to the boxes of F plus A plus C plus D plus I plus J, meaning that this whole area here and this whole area here that domestic suppliers are supplying to domestic consumers is now their increase in revenue from before, which was just A. Whereas for foreign producers, obviously the quota is going to limit their revenue by a lot, as their income changes from before, which was B plus C plus D plus E, which was this whole area between Q1 and Q2 from before, to just B plus H plus G, as now they can only supply between quantities Q1 and Q3 amount of goods of wheat to domestic consumers. And just like in tariffs, there's going to be two dead loss weight areas. And just to repeat from before, on the right side, it's going to be loss of consumer surplus, and on the left side, it's going to be loss of allocative efficiency due to lack of specialization and efficiency from domestic suppliers producing something that foreign suppliers could produce much, much better and with more efficiency. And also, like tariffs, there are going to be two extra side effects by imposing a quota on domestic consumers and domestic and foreign suppliers. The first of which, quite obviously, is that if overall quantity demanded and supplied for wheat decreases all the way from Q2 to Q4, then that much of here, this much of the demand curve right here, is now not going to be demanded because the demands are not going to be met. There's going to be a loss of consumer surplus equivalent to K because now the demand isn't being met, which is also known as the deadweight loss of consumer welfare. And again, after the quota, Q3 to Q4, which is now the increased amount that the domestic suppliers are going to supply to the domestic consumers, is going to be produced by relatively inefficient domestic farmers as opposed to the more efficient foreign farmers, which has J reflecting another portion of welfare loss. Okay, now that we've finished all the graphs for this video, let's reconnect back to some theory. So let's take a look at administrative barriers. We will now look at 3 different types of administrative barriers that governments may impose, which, if you guys don't know by definition, are barriers that, in general, make it more difficult for countries to trade one another, okay? Just like quotas, tariffs, and subsidies, there are a few other ways in which countries can use administrative barriers to prevent trade to a certain extent. And the examples we're going to be evaluating is red tape, safety standards, and embargoes. So let's take a look. Alright, to start with red tape. Well, when goods are being imported, there's usually administrative processes that have to be undertaken, which is known generally as red tape. If these processes are lengthy and complicated, then they can act as a restriction to imports. For example, making importers go through complicated paperwork before they can get their goods into a country will slow down imports. In addition, if the paperwork requires a large amount of legal work, then it will slow down the process even more and raise the cost to the importer. Sometimes countries may designate certain ports of entry that are difficult to reach and also more expensive. This may cause border delays and again raise costs. So red tape is really just a general term for ways in which a government can impose specific complicated paperwork, lengthy processes, or certain points of entry that are difficult to access or take a long time to access by the countries that people are trying to import from, thereby deteriorating how much we want to import due to the amount of time and money and complications that come with importing these goods. As for health and safety standards, this one's pretty straightforward, but various restrictions may be placed on the types of goods that can be sold in the domestic market, or on the methods of use in the manufacture of certain goods. These regulations will apply to imports and may restrict their entry. As mentioned before, while it is important that countries be able to guarantee the health and safety of the population by preventing the import of unhealthy or unsafe goods, it is also extremely important that governments are legitimately keeping out imports rather than simply protecting their country's own workers. So this is basically saying, as we explained before, one reason for protectionism that countries like to talk about is to protect the country from unsafe or unhealthy goods. And while sometimes this is taken to the extreme and countries like to use health and safety standards argument to excuse protectionist acts, in reality, governments actually do have to be aware of health and safety standards, especially when it comes to things like food or dangerous toys or things that are accessible to little kids that are imported from other countries. And lastly, we have embargoes. And in fact, if you don't know, an embargo is an extreme quota. It is a complete ban on imports and is usually put in place as a form of political punishment. For example, the USA has a trade embargo on all products from Cuba. And because they're so extreme, complete embargoes are quite rare. But more commonly, countries put in place a set of economic sanctions against an offending country. These limit the exports or imports of one of a few key products that are also used as a form of political punishment or to achieve a desired political objective. So essentially, obviously, if a country imposes a protectionist embargo and they completely ban a certain market or a complete country's markets from being able to be imported into said country, then obviously that's going to deter imports by law. And lastly, to sum up the theory of standard level content for this video, we have to mention nationalistic campaigns. Governments will sometimes run marketing campaigns to encourage people to buy domestic goods instead of foreign ones in order to generate more demand for domestic goods and preserve domestic jobs. Such campaigns have happened to countries such as UK, Australia, and the US, which may be described as a moral suasion, where the government links consumption of imported goods to the creation of unemployment. So if you guys think about this in the real world, obviously this happens a lot. When a country encourages people to buy from small businesses instead of these big businesses from around the world or online. For online, I'm thinking mostly Amazon, and for around the world, I'm thinking usually imports from China. And a lot of times, the countries will encourage people to buy from local suppliers and support local businesses. That way, from the government's perspective, they can save some domestic suppliers employment. And if you're just taking standard level IB economics, you can stop the video right now because now we're done. However, if you're higher level like me, let's continue on with just some simple calculations to run through. Alright, so we're going to be looking at some practice calculations, and before we even start to answer them, this will look incredibly reminiscent to, if you guys remember in microeconomics in the second unit, us calculating and answering questions from higher level about price ceilings and price floors. However, this time we're going to be doing it in the context of globalization. Alright, to begin with number 1, indicate the domestic equilibrium price and quantity on the graph. Fairly simple, okay? If we draw dashes down, we know that the quantity is going to be at 1 million liters of cooking oil, because cooking oil is the example we're doing here, at the price of $1.50, okay? So 1.5, I'll just write that right here. Number 2, cooking oil may be imported. The world price is at $1 per liter. Add the world supply curve to the graph. Okay, so obviously we know that we're going to create a price ceiling by drawing it here. And now this $1 is also going to be known as the world price of PW. And we could put S, if this is S domestic here, then we know this is S world supply, okay? So we can write world here, okay? And this is what it's going to look like for the first two answers. And so lastly, to continue on with these last few questions, let's take a look. Number 3, explain how much cooking oil will be supplied by domestic suppliers and how much will be supplied by foreign producers when free trade takes place. All right, so by drawing two new little quantities here down from where the world supply curve hits the demand and the domestic supply curve, we can draw Q1 here and then Q2 here, okay? And now obviously, as you can see, this first area here between 0 and Q1 is going to be supplied by domestic suppliers, whereas due to the new lower world price, quantities Q1 to Q2 is going to be supplied by world suppliers, whereas the demand beyond that is just ignored. And this all happens, of course, when free and foreign trade takes place. For number 4, the government imposes a tariff of 30 cents per liter. Show the effect of this on the graph. All right, so $1 plus 30 cents is going to be $1.30. So pretend this is a straight line. We now have this new tariff price, which is going to be shown as the world supply plus T for tariff. And now we can also label this as, I'm running out of space, so I'm just going to put T with world supply here, okay? With world price here. And now this is what the new curve is going to look like. And to show the full effect of this on the graph, we again draw new axes, little dashes here. To make quantities, I'm running out of space. Again, I keep saying that, so I'll write it down here instead, of Q3 and Q4. As now, we can say that the domestic supply increases from 0 to Q3, whereas the world supply decreases from Q3 to Q4 instead. All right, now for number 5, to calculate the change in consumer spending before and after the imposition of the tariff. All right, so as you guys can see here, before the tariff is installed, the equilibrium price is at $1.50, and the equilibrium quantity is at 1 million liters. So we can say that 1 million, okay, 1 times $1.5 is going to equal 1.5 million and that is going to be consumer spending before the tariff is imposed. However, if I just write it down here instead, after the tariff is imposed, the highest quantity that's going to be bought by domestic consumers is going to be at Q4 as it decreases from Q2 to Q4. So now the new equilibrium is going to be at quantity Q4 and at price, world price with the tariff, which is going to be at $1.30. So now we can say $1.30 times the quantity of Q4, which is going to be 1.2 million liters, which is going to equal overall $1.56 million of consumer spending after the tariff is imposed. All right, for number 6, now let's calculate the government tax revenue after the tariff is put into place. So if we show on this graph, if you guys remember from us analyzing tariffs before, these two little boxes created right here is going to be the amount of government revenue generated for putting on the tariff. So now we have to find the area of these little boxes. Between 1 and 130 is going to be 30 cents. So 30 cents, okay, times the quantity, which between quantities Q3 to Q4 is going to be about 400,000. Is going to generate the government revenue of 120,000, okay? So that is now going to be the increase in government revenue from imposing the tariff. All right, and lastly, for number 7, explain the impact of the tariff on any two of the stakeholders in the cooking oil market. Well, obviously, if you were asked to choose just 2 stakeholders, you should always choose the easiest ones. So for me, the easiest ones to think about is the government and consumers. Obviously, because of the new tariff, consumers are worse off because they now have to pay more money for a lower quantity of goods, as quantity overall shifts from Q2 to Q4, meaning that there was more excess demand and there was a loss of consumer welfare, shown by the little triangle right here, and now they have to pay more for the lesser goods so they can actually consume from foreign markets. By contrast, the government, as we've already calculated before, is getting more revenue from the tariff, so they are now better off because they can fund their government revenue, and the government might also benefit from the tariff as, since it limits imports, it also protects the domestic economy, which may further support the government in many different ways. And that'll be it for higher and standard level of Chapter 4.2 of Free Trade versus Protectionism in IB Economics.